but I want to tell you a little bit about Amanda, and then she's going to tell you about the topic. So Amanda, she is, let me minimize my screen so I can read this. The Hope West Coast Project Manager. As you can see on the screen, she's directed a national resource center providing training and technical assistance to providers supporting families affected by substance abuse and or HIV. She's worked extensively supporting LGBTQ plus families at the school district, medical, and community levels. And so what I am most excited about is for her to share this content, this valuable content with you today in the area of spreading hope. So Amanda, I want to say thank you for being with us. We are so excited. And with that, I'll say, take it away.
Thank you so much. And I don't want you to give up on that podcast stream about tetherball. You have the voice for it. And I would encourage you to pursue that dream.
I'm so encouraged. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's awesome to be here today. I currently live in Portland, Oregon, but lived in the Bay Area for about a decade. So excited to be presenting for CalTrin. I am here with my colleague, Lauren McCullough. Lauren, do you just want to say hi real fast?
Hello, everyone. I'm Lauren McCullough. I'm happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you. This is the rest of our team. We are based out of Tufts Medical Center in Boston, but we have folks kind of scattered about all around. We also have an awesome national advisory board made up of really fun, smart people that give us great ideas about how to do this work the most effectively. So what we're going to talk about today is hope, which is healthy outcomes from positive experiences. Here at Hope, we envision a world that recognizes, honors, and fosters positive experiences as being just as fundamental to people's health and well-being as other experiences. So I'm going to pause for a moment and just let you all reflect. There's a lot of talk, I know, especially in California and on the West Coast, about adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma. So I'd love for you to think about somebody you know, personally, professionally, maybe publicly, who's in the news, or it could be yourself, who's experienced childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences, but is doing okay today. You know, you would say that they are living a fairly healthy, successful life. So think of that person. And I'm just going to have you hold them in your mind. You don't need to share, but just hold that person in your mind because we're going to come back to them in just a bit. So why are we here? Why does HOPE, Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences, exist? Well, as I mentioned before, we believe that positive experiences can help children grow into healthy, resilient adults. And we want to make sure that we get the word out, that other people know that these positive experiences are just as critical to adult outcomes as those adverse experiences are. We are grounded in this core assumption that the positive exists, it is real, and it is worth growing. And that comes from our friends at the Montana Institute and the Science of the Positive. So I think we all kind of know intuitively, and research has backed us up, that positive experiences are important. They do a ton of things in that early childhood 0 to 5 period, but also throughout the lifespan, right? So not only do they promote health and well-being, which we'll talk a little bit about the research in just a moment, but they allow kids to form those strong, meaningful relationships with their caregivers, with their teachers. They cultivate confidence and positive self-image. They provide a sense of belonging, allowing kids to know that they matter. And they help build coping skills so that kids can cope with that stress that is inevitably going to hit them in some way, in healthy ways. And what we've learned, which is really exciting, is that positive childhood experiences actually protect adult mental health. Yet, kind of as a field, and take that in whatever field you're working in, it can be child abuse prevention, it can be family support, it can be pediatrics, it can be home visiting. we tend to focus on the negative. We are trained to screen for problems, to be deficit focused, to kind of figure out where the gaps are and fill them. And we at Hope are really hoping to shift the narrative a bit there, so that not only are we recognizing those gaps, we think that that's still important, but that we're also really taking the time to intentionally lift up what is going well with families, to see them holistically so that they're not just defined by their challenges and their deficits, but that they get to bring their strengths to the table as well. So we know that childhood experiences affect adult health outcomes, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the research says there. Now, I know that in registration you filled this out, but just so that we get a good sense of who is on the call here today, how much do you know about adverse childhood experiences? We have a poll here, so it can be, nothing, you've never heard of them, all the way to you're an ACEs expert, an adverse childhood experiences expert. And I'm not allowed to vote. So I'm going to be quiet for about 15 seconds and we'll let these poll results come in. All right, how's it looking, Lauren?
It looks like we have about 30 people who are still waiting on replying. Replies are still coming in. Give it a
All right, I'm going to count you down. I'll give you 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3. I know you can do it. 2, 1. All right, yeah, not surprising because this is for presentation for CalTrin, and a lot of you are from California. The majority of you know more than a little or are well-versed in ACEs. So, but there are some folks on here who it's newer information. So we're going to go through just kind of briefly, very briefly about ACEs, because it does, it grounds the conversation in positive childhood experiences in a different way. So very, very high level, adverse childhood experiences came out in the late 90s through a group out of Kaiser Family Foundation, and they found that there are essentially 10 kinds of adverse childhood experiences. And they grouped them into these 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so when we talk about ACEs, the majority of people still refer back to these 10 original ACEs. And I don't need to read here. You can see exactly what they are on the screen. Now, interestingly, those ACEs, those 10 adverse childhood experiences, were then linked to adult physical health outcomes. And what they found was pretty incredible. About 24% of all asthma cases could be attributable to childhood trauma. Same was true for depression. About 44% of cases of depression in adulthood could be attributed back to that childhood trauma. We got just a snapshot of kind of the most frequently reported health outcomes in adulthood that could be attributed back to childhood trauma. But this chart is much larger than this. And so overall, what ACEs tell us is that what happens when we are a child impacts our adult health. Largely, the idea is that that is through a toxic stress mechanism, that there is unmitigated toxic stress coursing through your body that raises your cortisol levels and, which can result in later physical health outcomes. Now, Wendy Ellis is brilliant. I love her. She designed the pair of ACEs. And what she said was, yes, ACEs exist. And you see the ACEs on the top half of the screen here. But what we also really need to look at is what is happening in the environment, because we tend to individualize ACEs and place blame on the parents for a child's ACE score. We say, this child has an ACE score of 4, we might have some judgment about those parents, when in reality, the majority of these ACEs stem from systemic issues that are completely out of the control of the parents. They come from poverty, from systemic racism, from poor housing, from violence in the community that kind of root up into these ACEs. So Wendy Ellis really believes that we can't talk about adverse childhood experiences without understanding their root causes, and kind of removing that blame on the individual for their ACE. So now, when we consider those original 10 ACEs, we also take into account the roots of them, right? The poverty, the institutional racism, historical trauma, war and migration, neighborhood effects, all of those things that are actually causing the ACEs. And so, as I mentioned, we know that adverse childhood experiences lead to that toxic stress, which can lead to poor health outcomes. But it's not destiny. ACEs aren't destiny. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. So first, I'd love to just learn how much folks know about positive childhood experiences. So same poll as earlier, except now I'm curious about positive childhood experiences, or PCEs. And I promised you we were going to move through that ACEs part really fast. And so I just want to say that I kept my promise there. But if people have questions, we're definitely going to have time for that. So you can pop it in the Q&A, or you can hold it until we pause for questions. How's it looking, Lauren?
Okay, we have about 30 people again who are still waiting to give their answers for the poll. So we'll give it a couple more seconds.
All right, we'll count you down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see. All right. So there's still more, the majority of you still say that you know more than a little, or are well-versed, which is awesome. It's really fun to see this, because when we first started doing these trainings, most people would say nothing or a little. And the more and more we do them, the more we see the responses coming in towards the bottom half of this poll, which is great, which is what we want to see. So we have our ACEs study that we talked about. And then there was also in 2015, in Wisconsin, they put out their Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, or the BRFIS survey. They asked about ACEs, but they also added questions in about positive childhood experiences. And then they then correlated how folks responded to their adult mental health. And so generally speaking, the questions that they added were these 7, and they were feeling questions, right? So it was, how often did you feel able to talk to your family about your feelings? How often did you feel your family stood by you during difficult times? How often did you enjoy participating in community traditions, feel a sense of belonging in high school, feel supported by friends, had at least 2 non-parent adults who took genuine interest in you and felt safe and protected by an adult in your home? So these were the questions they added in addition to the questions about ACEs. And what they found was incredible. So positive childhood experiences protected adult mental health. So for those folks who reported only having 0 to 2 PCEs in childhood, about 48% of them reported poor mental health. But what we saw was this dose-dependent effect, where the more positive childhood experiences people reported, the better their adult mental health. And for those who reported 6 or 7 positive childhood experiences, so essentially said yes to basically all of those questions that we just looked at, only about 12.6% reported poor mental health in adulthood. And this held up even in the presence of people who reported 4 or more adverse childhood experiences as well. So for those who had 4 or more ACEs and 6 or 7 positive childhood experiences, only about 20% reported poor mental health in adulthood, compared to those who had 4 or more ACEs and only 0 to 2 positive childhood experiences. About 60% of that category of folks reported poor mental health in adulthood. So what we're seeing is that these positive childhood experiences, even in the face of trauma, seem to have a protective effect on mental health. So we can go back to that chart we looked at earlier, and we know that adverse childhood experiences can create toxic stress, which can lead to poor health outcomes. But we now also know that positive childhood experiences can promote resilience, leading to better health outcomes. That there's some mechanism there with positive childhood experiences that block toxic stress and actually promote healing from the ACE, and have the potential, with enough in place, to prevent ACEs in the future. So how does this happen? How does this work? We're going to talk a little bit about the brain. I know this is going to be shocking. I am not a neuroscientist. I would imagine most of you are not as well. We're not going to leave this talk having a degree in neuroscience or the brain. Really, the goal of this particular section is just to talk about the beautiful resilience of our brain. You know, I think we hear a lot, or I hear a lot when people are talking about ACEs, that there's a crack in the foundation, that it changes the brain chemistry. And while all of that can be true, what's really important to understand is that positive experiences can do that too. So our brain doesn't change in one direction with trauma. Our brain changes anytime we have either something that is a repeating event that happens over and over again, or something that has dramatic impact. It doesn't care if it's positive or negative, it's going to respond to those things. So these are neurons, they connect with each other. And the crazy thing is that each neuron in our brain can make up to 10,000 connections to other cells, and these connections are not static. These connections change with experience. So if a child had experienced abuse early in life, those connections might have changed in response to that abuse. That child might have an exaggerated startle response because of those changed connections. The brain adapts to stay safe, right? But the beautiful thing is that those same 10,000 connections can also change when a child is presented with safety, with loving, caring relationships. And so over time, with enough support, that heightened startle reflex might back off a little bit. You might start to see that in less occasions as those connections change. So you'll see 2 little neurons here on the right side of your screen, and you'll notice that the one on the right has these little like noodle-shaped things. That's myelination. You don't need to know that word for any reason other than to know that when a neuron is myelinated in this way, it acts like what you see on the left, a superhighway, which means that it can transmit information super fast. Things just happen better with myelination. The one on the left still sends a signal, but it's going to take longer to get from point A to point B. Think about learning something new. So I started learning Spanish during the pandemic. And in the beginning, I had to think very intentionally and for a very long time to be able to string a sentence together. Those neurons were not myelinated yet. With practice, with training, that became an easier task. And I can now, though please don't ask me to prove this, string some sentences together much more quickly because my brain has changed in response to my learning, in response to my experiences. And what we know is that there are certain things that you can do that promote brain cell development, especially this myelinated brain cell development. And that includes things like interacting with people, exercising, moving your body, having an environment that is stimulating, pretty much everything that is the opposite of what we experienced in COVID over the last year and a half or so. But there are also experiences that can suppress this kind of brain cell development. And that includes having a sedentary lifestyle, social isolation, environmental deprivation. So when you think about ACEs and health outcomes and positive childhood experiences and health outcomes, you can see that the more positive childhood experiences you have, the more your brain changes and adapts to create those new connections in a way that is healthy and resilient. So you'll remember those. Actually, I can pause for a second here. Are there any questions that we should respond to?
Thanks, Amanda. We just have one question so far in the Q&A. If anyone else has others, please feel free to throw them in. But Adam would like to know if the PCE study was of adults and about their perception of their childhood experiences, would an adult's current mental health influence their answers, therefore having people with less optimal mental health outcomes reporting less positive childhood experiences due to their own current state of being? Do you have any thoughts on that, Amanda?
Yes, absolutely. I would say, so to answer your question, yes, it was about current mental health. And certainly I know on days that I am struggling with anxiety or low-level depression, I have a harder time being positive about my childhood, right? So absolutely, that is a confounding variable. It's also why, even though the statistics that came out of that survey were incredibly significant, we look at it as correlation, not causation, because there were too many kind of extenuating circumstances there. There is more research that's happening. 5 additional states have included PCEs in their BRFIS data that we're going to be analyzing this year. We're also doing a comprehensive lit review to look at this at this specific issue because we know it's there and we know that it's likely we can get to causation. But yes, at this point, it's correlation because of things like that. So thank you for the question, Adam. All right, so we talked about those 7 questions that were asked in the BRFIS survey. Between those 7 questions and some research done by Dr. Sege, who is our fearless leader, and I feel terrible that I did not point him out in that initial staff photo. He is the founder of the HOPE National Resource Center. He and Charlene Harper Brown published back in 2017 these 4 building blocks that came out of all of the different ways folks measure positive childhood experiences, right? Because we call them PCEs. They are also called counter ACEs. They're called benevolent childhood experiences. There's lots of different names for them. But generally speaking, they tend to cluster in these 4, when you think about it, fairly obvious building blocks. So at HOPE, I think kind of the foundational thing that we are trying to do is to promote positive childhood experiences, to increase access to positive childhood experiences in these 4 domains. So the first one is relationships. Obviously, the relationship with caregivers is important, but we know that sometimes that relationship is disrupted by ACEs or other mitigating events. And so when we talk about the building block of relationships at HOPE, We mean relationships with other children and with other adults who may or may not be caregivers. Those safe, supportive, loving relationships that help the child feel that somebody cares about them and that if something's going on, they have people they can talk to. So in the chat, I'd love to hear, I know that you all kind of come from all different kinds of organizations supporting families, but I'd love to hear if there are ways that you promote relationship, specifically relationship for kids in your work. Are there things that you do to help children with their relationships with adults or peers? Would love to hear about it.
So in the chat, we're getting some examples such as training parents in parent-child interaction skills, parenting education and family therapy, mommy and me classes. I have great memories from both, strangely enough, my own experiences being a me and mommy and me, and my sister's when she was a mommy. Authentic communication, parent support groups, infant massage and reading books to toddlers, giving parents on new activities to do with their children to bond.
You know,
Helping
there's
to
a lot of
playgrounds and more recent walking groups.
Oh, there's a lot of emphasis on infant massage, and I am all for somebody coming up with some research that shows that kids massaging their parents is also really therapeutic. So if anybody wants to work on that, I support you.
We also have music together, enrichment activities, allowing parents and children space to use their voices and provide their own choices and options. Mindfulness, education, a lot of great answers here.
That's awesome. What I love about the building blocks is that it's not rocket science, right? This is stuff that most of us who work with families and kids are already doing. And now there's research that says that if you can promote access to these 4 building blocks, you are actually promoting positive mental health for those kids in the future and mitigating the effects of adverse childhood experiences. You'll also see as we go through the building blocks, there's a lot of interaction between them. So the next one is environment. And this is a safe, stable, equitable environment to live, learn, and play. So this includes having basic needs met, right? So making sure that kids have food and shelter and clothing and a safe place at home. Also, safe places outside of the home and outside of school to play in their communities. And then obviously a school where they feel seen and heard and valued. So we heard a little bit of this already in the previous question, but would love to hear what you are doing to promote safe, stable, equitable environments to live, learn, and play at your work.
So just like last time, feel free to throw those examples into the chat and I will read them out.
I know a lot of the FRCs do basic needs support, and that's a huge way to help with environment.
Yeah, absolutely. That was our first example, help with basic needs.
Awesome.
Helping homemakers to assist in providing healthy environments, providing counseling and case management for parents to address basic needs, safety checks for the home environment,
yes,
family meetings that focus on problem solving and fun, safe activities, modeling safety and enriching people's voices and talents. I love this, using myself as a human to see other people for who they are and not how I want to see them. Shindana, that's a really great comment. I love that. Healthy cooking ideas using low-cost food so families can eat well. I love that.
Yes.
Nutritious meals are extremely important to safe environments.
Mm-hmm.
Staff who research and offer resources and resource centers that help families meet these needs. Showing ways to involve children in activities and to allow them to get used to the environment around them. life skills meetups weekly. I really like that. Some great answers here as well.
These are awesome. Thank you. You know, I think I don't know that I've said this explicitly, but when we talk about ACEs and that pair of ACEs, you know, making sure that we are not kind of blaming families for individual ACEs when a lot of times there are systemic factors at play. I also want to be clear that PCEs and positive childhood experiences are not the sole responsibility of the parents. The burden does not lie exclusively on their shoulders to provide PCEs for their kids. The whole "it takes a village" is legitimate, right? And a lot of times there are things that individual families cannot do about their environment, that these issues need to be taken up at, you know, at a community level, legislatively, through advocacy and things like that. So when we're talking about the building blocks, we tend to kind of focus on the micro level, on the individual family level, but it's important to know that for all of these building blocks, there are policy implications, there are community-wide implications that can go along with them as well. So the third building block is social and civic engagement. And so what we mean here is having the child engage in their community in a way where they feel like they matter, that they belong, that there is connection. So for very young kids, this could be as simple as having jobs in the home or in their daycare where they feel a sense of purpose. So it's not just a chore for the sake of having a chore, right? But for example, my child has an IEP. She is in 2nd grade. Sitting still is really challenging for her, especially when it comes to academics that do not come as easily to her, such as math. So she has a phenomenal teacher this year, and her teacher decided that her classroom job is that she is the cleaner upper, and that there are certain times where she needs to get up out of her seat and walk around the room with a trash can and collect people's scraps at their desks. And she and the teacher decided that one of the times she was going to do this was about halfway through when they were working on their math worksheets. So this gave her a sense of purpose in the classroom. She had an important role to play, and it also leaned in to what she needed to succeed. She needed to be able to get up out of her seat and move her body. She needs that every day and kind of reset her brain to be successful. So this could look like a lot of different things. As kids get older, obviously there are far more opportunities for them to engage, whether that be in sports, in drama, any kind of club, in faith-based communities, getting engaged there, volunteering in their community, any way that you can really foster this sense of belonging and this sense of purpose in groups. So would love to hear again how you're already doing this, because we know this work is happening and that we're not necessarily telling you anything that you don't already know. We're just kind of putting it together in a neat package. So in the chat, if you can drop in examples of how you're already promoting engagement in your work life, I would love to hear about those.
Yeah, we're getting some really great examples in the chat already. I'd actually like to call back to someone's comment about environment that I think works well with engagement as well, which was education on how to include children with home maintenance that are fun and skill building. I love that because not only are you improving the environment for the family, the child also feels engaged and like they have a purpose in the growth of the household. Promoting youth-centric programming to youth-serving CBOs. Connecting parents with resources on how to sign their kids up for different enrichment activities. Other community-based activities. The Hope worksheets developed by Dr. Chan Hellman. We actually spoke with him a few months back, the Hope Center in Oklahoma. They're good friends of ours. Love that. Connecting families with their local family resource centers. Using restorative practices conferences with students. And the opportunity to learn different jobs as helpers and to feel a sense of belonging. Really loving all of these.
Yeah, and I think also anytime that you can kind of authentically and meaningfully engage the voices of youth in your work, in your program design, anything like that is an incredible way, not only to increase access to that building block of engagement, but also just to make your services potentially even more relevant for the folks you're trying to serve. The picture you see here, Dr. Sege always likes us to note, is a group of students who designed our logo. So we reached out to some teens to help us with our Hope logo. And it was an awesome experience for us and definitely opened our eyes to more meaningfully engaging youth in everything that we do. So the last building block is emotional growth. And this is through playing and interacting with peers and adults for self-awareness, self-regulation. Often this happens during unstructured playtime, again, either with peers or with adults. We often share the example of, observing a Foursquare game at recess at an elementary school. So, if anybody has kids who are in elementary school or remembers elementary school, Foursquare is a game where you draw a square in chalk on the ground and divide it up into 4 quadrants. And then there's like a kickball kind of ball, and you bounce it, right? So typically what happens with Foursquare is that the kids spend, 2 or 3 minutes setting up the square and getting all situated, and then generally the rest of recess arguing about the rules. And from an outsider's perspective, they just wasted their recess. But what they are doing here is the epitome of this unstructured emotional growth. They're learning how to navigate rules. They're learning how to regulate their emotions, how to exist outside of adults kind of mandating their reaction. They get to figure out what feels good in that moment and what they need to be successful. I think emotional growth during COVID was an interesting phenomenon for a lot of families. I think that kids had the opportunity to practice that skill a whole lot more with the people they lived with, as opposed to their peers, for better or for worse. But just like the other building blocks, for this last building block of emotional growth, would love to hear about what you're doing to promote emotional growth in your work. How are you helping kids learn how to identify emotions or regulate their feelings or navigate complicated social interactions? And I know a lot of you in relationship talked about different parent-child therapies. That is absolutely a piece of it. But what else?
So we have here the brain in the palm of the hand as a technique to use, modeling, showing children how to enact emotional situations that they'll find themselves in, working with parents to emphasize self-regulation and labeling as well as modeling, doing reflection activities and having parents realize that they can be whoever they want to be so that their child realizes they can be who they want to be. A socialization program using aggression replacement training, social and emotional workshops for students and parents offered on a weekly basis, drawing and emphasizing art as a way for people to express themselves, both parents and children, validating emotions that come up, normalizing feelings, and specifying that we're on the same page as them. Trainings offered to parents and providers around social emotional growth and asking children's questions of wonder as opposed to posing judgment. Remembering to ask open-ended questions. And then TRBI, which is trust-based relational intervention, which is a trauma-based program focusing on empowering, connecting, and correcting principles. Really interesting.
I love it. So like I said, the 4 building blocks aren't rocket science. It sounds like most of you are already doing this in your day-to-day interaction with families. So at Hope, what we're trying to see happen in the field is this shift kind of away from this focus on the deficits to a culture where you are assessing for what strengths they have kind of in each of these 4 building blocks, and where the community or your organization can help fill in and bolster those building blocks. So let's now go back to that person that you thought of way in the beginning, about 40 minutes ago or so, who experienced childhood trauma or ACEs, but seems to be doing okay today. Think back to that person. And if you know, I'd love to hear what you would consider to be some of their positive childhood experiences. So how did they get here today? What were those pieces of resilience that helps them grow into the person that they are today? And feel free to drop that in the chat. I'm seeing a lot around relationships and social connectedness. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We have some caring adults coming in to take the place of parents, other caring adults that connected outside of the parents, like neighbors and teachers, strong, supportive, and consistent relationship with siblings. I love that. My siblings were a great support for me as a kid as well. Connection with teachers. Being allowed to set achievable goals as a child and being able to successfully achieve those goals. Community group connections, social groups, hobbies such as music and art classes and crafts, extended family support. Having a parent that's willing to seek outside help, that's extremely important to note there. And focusing on strengths of the child and communication and listening to that child. There's a lot of really great examples of PCEs that would have been really impactful in someone's ultimate health outcomes.
I love it. All right. So we'll pause here if anybody has any questions. I know we kind of dumped a lot of information at you relatively quickly.
So there are no questions in the Q&A at the moment. If anyone feels the need to, please feel free to raise your hand and you can either come off mute or we can accept questions in the chat or in the Q&A section.
Awesome. So we can pause at any time to answer some questions. I'm going to keep going, but if something comes up, please don't hesitate to just pop it in the Q&A. Raise your hand. Any of those things that Lauren just said works just fine. So what does this look like in your work? Well, we're going to do a little activity here. So in the chat, I would love for you to look at this picture and type in the risk factors that you see happening for this family. And Lauren will read them off as they come in. What are some risk factors that you see going on here in this photo?
So we're seeing home repair issues, some holes in the wall and things of that nature. There are cleaning supplies that are accessible. It looks like there is some secondhand smoke, insects on the walls. There seems to be some hygiene issues just overall. A lot of people are pointing out the cigarettes and smoking being a big risk for the children. It doesn't seem like people are interacting with each other very much. They're sort of all off in their own world. There are cords on the floor. There seems to be a lot of clutter. And safety issues, risk of things like the TV falling on the children. So quite a few risk factors we're seeing here.
So same picture, but this time I'd love for you to pop in the chat what you see as protective factors, or what is going well for this family. What are some strengths you can notice? Ooh, I think you're muted, Lauren.
Sorry. So the family seems to have some sort of faith or religious background. They have food. They're all in the same room together. They also have pets, which we know are a great positive experience for kids growing up. A lot of people are mentioning that the family is all together, that even though they may not be looking at each other, they're spending time in a way. The children have clothing and glasses, which indicates medical care. Again, there's food in the home. It seems as though someone might be employed who's no longer there. There's a jacket and shoes off on the side.
Yeah.
They also have electricity, and none of the children seem to be in any way injured.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is a roof over their head. They have TV. There is food in the house, right? There are things that are going well for this family. So we're going to do one more poll, and I'm curious, which was easier to see here, the risk or the protective factors? What was easier for you to identify? We'll give you about 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, what are we working with? Risk factors were easier to see. Yes, of course they were. First of all, we primed you, right? We asked you for those first. Second of all, most of our education and training has primed us, especially when we're working with families. The majority of us are mandated reporters. I'm a social worker by background. We are trained to assess for child abuse risk, for basic needs, things like that. Let me be clear. Hope is not saying to stop doing that. That is really important, critical work that you are doing. That is keeping kids safe. We need to continue to assess for those things. But what we are saying is that when you're able to look at a family holistically and focus also on what is going well for them, you create a different kind of relationship. You see them as a whole person, not just as their risk factors or their deficits. And so even if you have to have a hard conversation about some of those risk factors, if you can connect through what is going well first, that conversation will likely go easier every time. For most of us, we are trained to see risk. This becomes type 1 thinking, which means it's kind of our gut response. It's what we go to first. It's unconscious, it's fast, it's intuitive, it's effortless. It's what all of our training and experience has shown us to do. That's why most of us see those risk factors first. It's what we practice the most, right? Remember those 10,000 connections for each neuron in our brain? They have been taught to connect to other neurons to identify risk. Still important, we're not saying don't do it, but what we are saying is that this type 2 thinking, where you chose to focus on protective factors, where you told your brain, hold up, now I want to see what's going well, that's type 2 thinking. It's slower, it takes effort. Generally, it's something new. It's calculating. You really have to think about doing it. Now, like we talked about before with the brain, most things that are type 2 can become type 1 thinking, can become effortless with practice. And we believe that just like seeing risks is effortless, it would be lovely to get to a point where you practice that, where that becomes part of your routine, so that screening for strengths also becomes type 1. Now, something to note is that type 1 thinking is critical to our survival, right? First of all, start there. If we're being chased by a lion, people always go to lions or bears. That's actually not my experience living in Portland. I don't run into them often, but let's just say we're being chased by a lion. We want type 1 thinking. We don't want to have to think about what to do in that moment. We want our brains to just kick into automatic and go. And also, type 1 thinking tends to be where our implicit biases lie, right? Because it's unconscious, because it's an immediate reaction to difference. Everything that we have taken in from the time that we are children helps inform type 1 thinking. So any kind of cultural, racial, socioeconomic, geographic, sexual orientation, identity biases that you might have will come out in that type 1 thinking. Whereas type 2 thinking, which is slower, more intentional, slows us down and helps us notice where these thoughts are coming from to navigate these biases and potentially help us mitigate these biases.
So just before we move on, Amanda,
Yeah.
I think we have a couple of participants with their hands raised. Maddie, did you have a question that you'd like to pose to the group? All right, feel free to ask if you'd like or to throw it into the chat. For now, we also have one in the Q&A. Rawan would like to know, the brain's ability to change in response to experiences is stronger in the first few years. So how important is it to have PCEs in early years versus later in life from this sort of perspective?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the earlier the better. And what we're finding with this lit review that we're currently undertaking is adolescence is also an incredibly salient time for positive childhood experiences because of all of the brain growth and learning and development that's happening there with that influx of hormones. There's something about adolescence where even if a child has not had a ton of positive childhood experiences up to that point, kind of flooding them in adolescence or just offering one can have a dramatic effect later on. So yes, of course, everything that we read about brain science says like 0 to 5 is a critical time, but all is not lost if it doesn't happen in the 0 to 5 age range. You know, we know a lot of kids who are in foster care who don't actually have the opportunity for a ton of PCEs until they're much older. They are still protective. Thank you, though. That's a great question and something that does come up often.
And I'd also like to toss in, Dr. Sege also often talks about stroke recovery and neurodevelopmental changes happening in adults, in people who were previously illiterate and learning to read, in people who experience intense in-depth meditation training. So while 0 to 5 is a clinically studied critical period, it's not the only period that the brain can change. And I would say that these experiences can be helpful for mental health all the way up into adulthood.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I see a few more questions coming in and I am aware of the time and I want to be respectful. And I know that that CalTrin has some great resources coming up too that I want to share with you. So Lauren will pop my email in the chat. Our website is right here. Please feel free to reach out to me directly with questions. Always love to talk about the framework. We have a ton of resources on our site if you want to learn more. Also, December 7th and 8th, we are doing some in-depth HOPE implementation workshops with CalTrin from 10 to 12. And I believe if you sign up for their newsletter is what I heard, then you will learn more information about that. And so we will have an opportunity to go more in depth there. We would love to hear what you thought today. If you could take a moment, it's a super brief evaluation form. We are always changing how we do this based on your feedback. We really do listen. I would love to hear what you thought, good, bad, ugly, whatever you're thinking, we want to know about it. So I think Lauren can also drop that into the chat as well. And that's us. That is HOPE. Positiveexperience.org is the website. My email is awin1@tuftsmedicalcenter.org. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. This has been lovely. And I do encourage you to reach out if you have follow-up questions, if you want to talk about what this looks like in practice for you. Come join us in those implementation webinars on the December 7th and 8th. But thank you all. This has been lovely.